Buenas tardes a todos. Muchas gracias por acompañarnos. En representación de la Asociación Mexicana de Especialistas en Nutrición Animal, les doy la más cordial bienvenida a nuestro tercer seminario de nutrición de este 2021. Es tiempo de la nutrición acuícola y el evento del día de hoy estará enfocado al importante tema de la sustentabilidad en la alimentación de las especies cultivadas. Un viejo amigo de la AMENA, a quien agradecemos mucho su apoyo, el doctor Luis de Abramo, nos estará dictando esta ponencia y la sesión estará coordinada por nuestra experta en el área, la doctora María Teresa Viana. Es importante señalarles que esta presentación es en inglés y ustedes tienen la posibilidad de escucharla en español yéndose a la barra de herramientas, hasta abajo, en donde está interpretación, seleccionan el idioma, en este caso el español. Les recordamos que el próximo jueves 18 tendremos la Asamblea General Ordinaria, por lo que les invitamos atentamente a inscribirse a este evento. Dejo el control con la doctora Tere Viana, a quien saludamos y también agradecemos su apoyo. Buenas tardes, Tere.
¿Qué tal? Buenas tardes, Francisco. Bueno, pues para mí es un gusto estar con ustedes, y más, sobre todo, por tener a un invitado tan importante y verdaderamente querido por toda la AMENA, que nos ha impartido muchísimas presentaciones y ha sido acompañante en muchos de nuestros congresos. Y bueno, pues lo tenemos aquí, y si hablo un poco de él, que yo creo que todo el mundo tiene conocimiento de lo que hace Lou de Abramo. Lou de Abramo estuvo asociado a la Universidad de Mississippi, es la Universidad Estatal de Mississippi desde el 2008. Actualmente está jubilado por esa universidad, pero sin embargo trabaja en la Universidad de Alabama en Birmingham. ¿Qué les puedo decir? Algo de lo más conocido que nosotros sabemos es su libro de nutrición de crustáceos, que es fabuloso, y yo creo que es el material que tenemos nosotros para consulta continua. Pero el doctor de Abramo, pues, ha sido distinguido, le dieron la distinción del 2003 al 2013, la Williams Giles Distinguished Professor of Wildlife, Fisheries and Aquaculture, por la Universidad de Mississippi. Y bueno, tiene más de 200 artículos publicados, también tiene muchos capítulos de libro, ha hecho contribuciones muy importantes, y en los últimos años también hizo una contribución con un grupo de investigadores de distintas áreas en nutrición animal, precisamente en este tema, sobre la sustentabilidad de la nutrición animal. Y bueno, pues sin más preámbulo, Lou, welcome to AMENA again, and please start your talk. We are very eager to listen to you.
Thank you very much. And it is a pleasure to be here today with you. And I thank AMENA for the opportunity to provide my ideas about the future of aquafeeds. The focus of my presentation is divided into 4 parts. First, I'm talking about the protein demands of a growing global population and how those demands are going to be met. I will talk about then the important role, the pivotal role of aquaculture, and the guiding principles in the production of aquafeed for aquaculture enterprise. Okay, I'll start with the focus of my presentation. I'm sorry. It's divided into 4 parts. First has to do with the protein demands of a growing global population. And how are those demands going to be met? And what will be the role of aquaculture? And with the role of aquaculture, what are going to be the guiding principles for aquafeed production at least the next 30 years or so. And with that guiding principle of aquafeed production, we need to be more specific about the ingredients that will compose those aquafeeds. What will they be and how will they be used? If we take a look at world population, right now, we are at about 7.6 billion people in the world. And by the year 2050, we are talking about anywhere between 9 billion to about 9.9 billion people. So with the scenario of a global population increasing to 9.6 billion, we have probably a 40 to 75% increase in the protein demand by 30 years from now in the year 2050. And there will be a greater demand for animal rather than plant protein. In fact, right now, more animal protein is consumed in the world than plant protein. And because of that, obviously, animal feed will be needed to produce the animal food. I can't move forward now for some reason.
I think that if you
Okay.
under to the left, you have, yeah, exactly.
I've got it. Okay. So I'm sorry again for the interruption. Not all sources of food, protein, are the same in terms of the type of nutrition that they provide. And most importantly, something that I'm going to talk about later, their impact, their production, the impact that it will have on the environment. If we take a look at socioeconomic considerations as it relates to the global world population, by that year 2050, it is estimated that 70% of the global population is going to live in cities and urban areas. So there's going to be a movement from rural areas to people residing in cities, urban areas by 2050. And due to that, there's going to be about a 72% increase in the meat production that will be consumed primarily in developing countries. If you look at the graph, it's basically describes the amount of protein, meat protein that's going to be, or animal protein that's going to be consumed over time. This just goes from about 1960 to 2011 and is still increasing. Whereas you can see in the developed countries, not much of an increase has been going on. It's staying basically at a steady state. But in the world, the blue, the increase, there is a major increase. And in fact, most of that can be attributed to developing countries. So the prevailing challenges of meeting animal protein demand is a reduction in natural resource use, a reduction in the carbon footprint, preparing for climate change, both on land and in the ocean and in aquatic environments, and also meeting animal welfare concerns. Obviously, climate change and carbon footprint are directly related. In terms of sustainable food sources, diets without environmental impacts contribute to food and nutrition security and to a healthy life. And for people now in the world and in future generations, sustainable food sources must optimize natural and human resources. Now, if we take a look at beef cattle production, just as an example, the performance over the years, starting in 1977 and up to about, I believe, was 2015, to produce 1 billion kilograms of beef, you need only 70% of the animals that you needed in 1977, only 81% of the feedstuffs, 88% of the water, and 67% of the land. So basically, this is a conservation of natural resources, producing more beef in this case with less animals and less use of feedstuffs. And this translates into a reduction in the total carbon footprint of about 16%. So in relationship or in response to the need for increases in meat globally, you can see that in this case with beef cattle production, there has been a response such that more beef is being produced with less, if you will, natural resources. If you take a look at the global meat resources in terms of a division, you can see that as sources of protein, right now, it is about 494 million metric tons. And that's divided into these 5 areas: poultry, seafood, pig, porcine, cattle, and other probably being lambs and goats. So you can see, first of all, that seafood is providing the most global meat resources right now, outdistancing poultry and pig. In fact, recently, poultry pulled ahead of pig. Cattle is about 14.2%, and I say the other sheep and goats about 5%. But by 2050, if we're going to meet the protein demand for that population in the world, and due to the fact that much of the world is moving from a rural environment to an urban environment, we're going to need an additional 250 to 300 million metric tons of meat. Now, where is that going to come from? Well, if you take a look at these particular animal production scenarios, if you compare them, if you have 1 kilogram of feed, and if you were to look at the food consumed versus the weight or protein gained, you can see that the worst situation is for beef cattle. And in fact, beef cattle uses a considerable amount of resources, both land and water. Then comes pig, then chicken, and then fish. And in this case, it's a demonstration simply that fish, in terms of production, is definitely the most efficient feed conversion in terms of either weight or protein gained. And of course, this is one of the rules that we're looking for in terms of production of animals, and that is producing the most with the least amount of protein in the feed. Now, a lot of this has to do with the physiology of the fish, but we can see major differences. And the point here is simply fish are much more efficient in terms of taking a certain amount of feed and transferring it, if you will, or converting it to either weight or protein gained. So agricultural animal production, whether we're talking about fish, crustaceans, marine animals, freshwater animals, freshwater aquatic animals, I should say, that production, to be sustainable, really has 3 parts to it. And those 3 parts I think we're familiar with. One has to do with environmental sustainability. Another one has to do with economic sustainability. And finally, social sustainability. You want to reduce the environmental footprint, greenhouse gases, the amount of carbon dioxide that is released in association with the production of a particular species of animal. You want to reduce the cost of protein per unit production of animal protein, again, illustrated best by one of the previous slides where I showed a comparison of fish with poultry, pig, and beef cattle. And you also have to be aware of societal determinants, what might affect changes in society that might be not the situation that we want to be, or what I would call negative. Now, if you look at a cultured meat source, we talk about the percentage of beef cattle meat that is currently produced in order to satisfy the protein demand globally. It's not very much, and it's not very efficient. So if we're looking for different sources of meat, in this case, meat from beef cattle, there is some work that is being done. In fact, these products are available where they have cultured meat source. That is, they're taking stem cells from the beef cattle and actually producing meat that would be associated with beef cattle. And as you can see there in the sign, is lab-grown meat. the future of proteins. And this may be another source, or may begin to replace beef cattle because of the low conversion, feed conversion, and also because of the increased amount, or I should say comparatively large amount of resources that are used to grow cattle, both water and land, as a source of protein. I'll also talk about principles besides sustainability, holistic principles. And what I mean by that essentially is a recognition of the components of something. In this case, we're talking about global food security. We're talking about global food security as it relates to meeting the protein demand of an increasing population, and how they are integrally connected and are often, always, I should say, explained by reference to the whole. We're talking about, in this case, holistic, a balance, an integration, efforts that are based upon this balanced integration to meet the goal of satisfying that protein demand or the global food security. You take a look at global protein and caloric consumption, and you look at the proportional changes in these sources. This is what I'm talking about in terms of a holistic approach: balance, integrating them, and sustainability. These are all the components which help to satisfy the protein demand globally. And we want all of them to be safe, sufficient, and nutritious. These are the components or the characteristics of food security. We have plants, including seaweed. We have terrestrial animal production, which would include pork, beef, goats, sheep. We have another aspect, insects. There is a lot of insect consumption, which is a good source of protein in the world, and aquatic food production. Another way of contributing to food security is being able to reduce the amount of food waste that exists globally. So these are all working together, and we want to get a balance of these to satisfy or to address the goal of food security in the world. If you take a look at food waste and its impact on global warming, we're talking about carbon dioxide equivalents, and you can see the various countries of the world and what the contribution is of each of these countries in terms of the global warming. If you look, the third one past China and the United States, food waste actually contributes 30% in comparison to the other sources, in this case, countries. We're comparing food waste to countries, and you can see that 30% of food waste contributes to the total amount of global warming. Something I think that not many people are aware of, the wastage of food that's produced that is never consumed. So, what will be the principal contributor to that 250 to 300 million metric tons of meat that is needed? And I think we've come to the point, and I'll show this in some slides that are coming up, that aquatic animal production really is the most attractive protein source in terms of efficiency, in terms of conversion of protein in the feed to protein in the animal, in terms of the amount of food that is converted into weight. So this has become one of the fastest growing food sectors in the world. Just to give you an idea of just the resources that are available despite the efficiency of growing aquatic species. If you were to use just 1/10% of the estuarine and marine waters in the United States for marine culture, you could potentially produce 90 million metric tons of seafood. So the environment, the marine environment and the estuarine environments in the United States and other countries of the world are not being used in order to produce a tremendous amount of protein that is available. And as you can see here, just with 1% of the use of those waters, you could generate potentially 90 million metric tons of seafood. If you look at the state of the world fisheries and aquaculture, this is from 2018, an FAO report, you can see that aquaculture in this case was producing as much as the capture fisheries. And it continues to grow. And in fact, aquaculture has now exceeded, in terms of the millions of metric tons that are produced, exceeds the capture fisheries or the natural fisheries. So it continues to grow, and it is going to be a very good source of meat that in turn would be the source of protein that is needed for the ever-increasing population of the world. And if you take a look at just the total production of farmed fish and crustaceans, those farmed fish and crustaceans that are fed, those that are needed some source of aqua feed, now at about 61.8 million metric tons, which actually comprises over 50% of the total global aquaculture production. So it demonstrates to you that those aquatic species that are being fed make up a tremendous contribution to the total global aquaculture. But what it also means is that we're going to have a considerable amount of aqua feed. And where are we going to get that aqua feed, and what are the constituents of that aqua feed going to be? Well, the strategy for any kind of aquaculture production as a protein source is being very efficient. We know that it is very efficient, being very productive, and introducing types of innovation, whether they be culture systems, feed, and other components to basically have a strategy that will be most efficient, most effective to meet the demands. Just moving into the realm of aquafeed, the aquafeed demand in terms of millions of tons and how it's changed just from the beginning of the 21st century. And you can see that the increase, I think, is probably over 270% in terms of the total aquafeed demand. But just in the last 5 years, from 2020 until what we expect is going to be need for 2025 to meet the demand, we're talking about a 24% increase. But these figures are placed here to give you an idea of the rapid increase in the demand for aquafeed globally. So what's the future for aquafeed? Well, I think the future demands a recognition that we need to improve. And a lot of the emphasis has been on the replacement of fish meal and fish oil in many diets for both crustaceans and fish, particularly carnivorous fish and carnivorous crustaceans. There are limitations of the level of sustainability that can be reached, and also the importance of what I mentioned before, that integrated, balanced approach, a holistic approach. So the future has to address these particular aspects. Now, if you look at the evolution of the measures of quality of aquafeed ingredients, probably at the beginning of the 20th century, we were concerned with, in the past, qualitative and quantitative nutrient levels. We were interested in qualitative and quantitative nutrient requirements. We're interested in the digestibility of ingredients in terms of what nutrients those particular ingredients were going to provide. Obviously, we were interested in the cost, and particularly in terms of preparation and shipping, and also availability. Well, that has changed. Those things still exist, but we're evolving, and we're seeing other characteristics that are very, very important in terms of the development of aquafeeds. Sustainable feeds that are developed that are environmentally stable, that are economically stable, and that are sustainable, I should say, and socially sustainable, both assuring both feed and food safety. What kind of environmental footprint does the particular feed that has been produced put upon the environment? This is an environmental sustainability characteristic. Scalability. This is a characteristic that not many people have thought about in the past. You'll see in the literature many published investigations that deal with many different type of ingredients that have been tested, evaluated in terms of potential ingredients or ingredients for aquafeeds, but nothing is talked about in terms of whether there'll be a significant amount of this particular ingredient available. It's called scalability. And can you go to a higher, can you move to a higher scale in terms of production and still be economically sustainable? There are a lot of these different types, I'll call them kind of unusual ingredients that seem to have some value as it relates to the study that was being published, but can they actually be used on a large scale? Can you scale up the production of that particular ingredient that you're looking at? Also very interested in ingredients that would normally be able to be consumed by humans. We want to try to reduce the amount of, let's say, plant material that can be used by humans in order to satisfy protein demands, rather than being introduced into the feeds. Other factors are just a dependency of importing that particular ingredient to make an aquafeed, and how we can increase the nutritive value of what we have. We may have a particular ingredient. What can we do to it technologically to potentially increase or enhance the value of that particular ingredient as it becomes a component of an aquafeed? So you can see how ideas have begun to evolve in terms of what we're looking for in ingredients to produce aquafeeds. So the overarching solution for aquafeeds, in my opinion, to meet the protein demands of 2050, we need a balance of sustainable animal, plant, and alternative protein sources to meet those food security goals. And in association with that, we know we're going to have to change the protein sources that we've been using in the past to meet the nutritional demands. And this goes back to what I was talking about before, about integrating and changing the relative contribution of particular sources of meat or particular sources of protein to satisfy the global demand. So feed formulation, and I mentioned this in a previous slide, kind of, it's guided by providing essential nutrients, by creating the most efficient way of providing nutrients to an animal. It's not essential ingredients. We're not talking about essential ingredients. People in the past have talked about fish meal and fish oil and how they are essential ingredients. They're not essential ingredients. The ingredients we're looking for are the ones that provide the essential nutrients in the most efficient way. Now, what are those new sources of ingredients? Some of you have undoubtedly heard about these. I want to go over them a little bit. Waste materials. And I'm not going to go into too much detail about the characteristics of these particular sources of ingredients to provide in aquafeed. But they're very important. I think that they will be the future. Poultry byproduct meal. This is a waste really from the rendering of the production of poultry meat to partially provide for meeting the protein demands globally in the future. Distillers' dried grains and solubles, again, a byproduct of a particular type of process. Using that, both of them are fairly good sources of protein, and also amino acid profiles are very, very similar to fish meal. Another one that I think everyone is aware of that really hasn't taken on yet, probably because it's not at the point where we feel it can be economically sustainable, but single cell proteins. Protein that's being produced with sources being bacteria, fungi, or algae, and using probably, in most cases, agricultural waste. We're using waste and taking it and efficiently using it to make single-cell protein using these microorganisms. Genetically modified plants are now being used to produce LC-PUFAs, which are long-chain polyunsaturated fatty acids, which have been found to be very, very important in satisfying nutrient requirements of aquatic animals, particularly marine aquatic animals. Insect meal, there are a number of products available right now that are a meal that is produced from insects, and these insects are grown on waste. Some of that waste may be from seafood, and some of it may be from agricultural processes. We also see taking technological processes and like fermentation and increasing the nutritional value of particular meals that have been produced. Seaweed, again, I think will be another good source in the future of ingredients. So nowhere do we see there anything that says fish meal, and nowhere do we see possibly a exclusive use of one of these products to totally substitute, but probably the combination of two or three of these products will satisfy that. And the products that we choose obviously have to be environmentally sustainable. Again, if you look at the top here, just a recently published paper having to do with global adoption of novel aquaculture feeds could reduce the forage fish demand by 2030. And that forage fish, again, talking about the balance and integration, which is a holistic approach, those forage fish could be consumed rather than being used as a source of ingredients for aquaculture feeds. Some of the other materials that have been commonly used in aquaculture feeds, again, many of them are byproducts of processes. So they're basically waste, but waste can be used in a very efficient way. Blood meal, feather meal, poultry meal, and one of the trademarks is called enviro meal, which are defatted larvae of insects. So there are many other products that are now becoming available, and the question is whether we can scale up to needs if we find that particular ingredient to be very sustainable and contributing to the holistic idea of producing aqua feeds. Also, I mentioned to you about being able to increase or enhance the value of particular ingredients and aqua feeds. And we've found that certain additives, nucleotides, amino acids, and probiotics and prebiotics, these are areas that have been under investigation for quite a while, and including them in a aqua feed can, in fact, increase the efficiency even more in terms of providing the most protein for the least amount of protein, most protein from using the least amount of protein in the aqua feed. So the things that we have to keep in mind when we're producing aqua feeds in relationship to the ingredients that we choose, and there are a lot of characteristics for those ingredients that I went over, is first of all, what I've been trying, the point that I've been trying to get across is that we have to adhere to sustainability and holism concepts. Again, the scale of production. Can we produce enough of that particular ingredient so that it can be incorporated into aqua feeds? And you saw the number of metric tons of aqua feeds that are being produced now to meet the demand. Is it cost competitive? In some cases, it cannot be cost competitive with other ingredients, and that has to be taken into consideration, even though it may do better in a feed. Again, this is a component of economic sustainability. The value of the farm species can have an effect on what the choice of ingredients will be to include in an aqua feed, and also the type of culture systems that are being used for the array of aquaculture species that are now grown and farmed. The culture system can kind of dictate the type of ingredients that you're going to use in a aqua feed. So my forecast for the next 30 years, based upon, again, this whole guideline of sustainability and keeping in mind environmental impact, the economic sustainability of some of the ingredients that might be used as potential components of aqua feeds. The logical choice, again, this is my opinion, to meet the global animal protein demands is seafood. That's not to say that we're going to reduce the amount of poultry that's being produced or the amount of bovine meat that's being produced, but we know that the best way to produce animal protein is through fish. And we know that it's an efficient system and that the resources available, as I illustrated, for marine and estuarine aquatic animal production. We know that aquaculture in freshwater, again, there's the demand for water, there's a demand for land. And again, if we're going to keep up with the needs, we're going to have to develop systems on land where more water is conserved, more land is conserved, and also moving into situations where we have tank culture. We have to talk about changes in ingredient composition of aqua feeds based on, as I said, sustainability and holistic concepts. Fish meal, fish oil derived from forage fish really has to be replaced. It may not have to be eliminated, but totally, but we're trying for that particular goal so that we can use those forage fish that are used to produce the meal for human consumption. Utilizing food processing waste. Use them as feed and feed ingredients, and I gave several examples. And another very efficient system that is coming about too is recycling waste, whether it be in these integrated concepts that we have in aquaculture, integrated multi-trophic aquaculture, IMTA, or even biofloc technology, where the waste material that the fish or crustaceans are being produced produce more food for them. There's even some work that's being done now looking at excessive biofloc material and systems that can be used and made into an ingredient. We've got to find a way to reduce the amount of agricultural crop-based ingredients that are used in feeds. So again, some of that material can be used for direct consumption by people. Technological innovation to enhance or increase the value of those feeds, very important, including genetic engineering. And we have to keep in mind, what's I think very, very important, is developing a transparency of supply chain and certification, just like we have certification of aquaculture enterprises. This has to be extended to feed ingredients and aqua feed. We have to develop a transparency in feed supply chains, going from the global raw material producers to the global markets. It's very, very important that we have confidence in the ingredients that we're using and confidence in the feeds that ultimately are produced from those ingredients. I'm going to stop there, and I think I have enough time where I can answer some questions or listen to some comments. But I hope that you have a pretty good idea now of where I think aquafeed development is going in the future and how important aquaculture is going to be as a contributor to the protein demand globally.
Thank you very much, Lou. I do really appreciate it. And we have here several questions. The first one is from Fernando Futcher, and he says, the byproducts from fisheries and aquaculture, such as fish meal, as byproduct, fish meal, shrimp exoskeleton, all the shells from crabs, or for any crustaceans, what do you suggest to use them? To use them in aquaculture or to use them in animal production?
Mm-hmm. I think that, well, if I understand the question correctly, I think that any type of feed, I talk specifically about aqua feeds, but any type of feeds that are developing for animal agricultural production, that there's going to have to be some changes. And again, it has to go back to this holistic approach where we can begin to use some of the food that was going into the ingredients of these feeds that can actually be used for consumption by the human population.
Yes. Another question is, currently, do you think that aquafeed is truly sustainable?
Yes, I think that it is truly sustainable. I think that from what I have presented, I think that it's a difficult goal. But I think, like I say, if we begin to look at it holistically in terms of the ingredients that we choose and how we produce these feeds, that it can be sustainable. I think one of the problems that we have too with whatever animal agricultural production that we're talking about, whether it's chickens or whether it's pork or fish, crustaceans, aquatic animals, is that there's a tremendous competition with pet foods and the development of pet foods. And the problem there is, what we're going for in terms of economic sustainability is not what they're going for. Most people will buy whatever they need to pay to supply the nutrition for their pets.
Yeah. And it's even much more expensive, more than double.
Right. Expensive. So this is a competition, if you will, and it's something that needs to be taken into consideration because pet foods are not going to go away, and they use a lot of the ingredients. And so again, scalability, scaling up the production of some of these potential ingredients that people report on in the literature, well, they may work very well under the circumstances that they're used and in conjunction with some of the other ingredients. But can you really scale up the production of that particular ingredient so that it is still economically practical? And in many cases, it will be economically practical for pet foods, but it won't be for what we're talking about here in terms of food that's being, I say animals that are being used for the production of meat and to solve the protein demand.
Okay. Here is another one. As long as feed compounders are dependent of a very few nutrient sources, many autophagy, aquaculture will continue hurting? I don't know if I understood well.
I'm not sure I understand it either. I'm sorry.
Well, if the nutrient sources are autophagic, maybe they means that fish is eating fish. Mm-hmm. It could be. So it will continue hurting. It was more probably like a comment. Mm-hmm. Well, the next question is the spirulina. Is economical feasible to have a plan for production of spirulina?
Of what?
How to say, the microalgae, the green microalgae.
Right. Yes.
Do you think it can be feasible to produce spirulina? Mm-hmm. Spirulina, I don't know.
Spirulina, yes.
Spirulina. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think that, there has been a lot of work done with it. And I think as the technology advances, that right now it might be what we would call economically practical, but I think we have to have good faith in some of the technological advances that are being made. And that, yes, I do think that that's potentially an ingredient that we could consider.
Mm-hmm. The macrocystis, as we call sargasso, I don't know, the weeds, seaweeds. Yes. Those seaweeds that they have been hanging in the sea lately, in the shore, in the Caribbean, in Mexico, Do you think can be used as a ingredients for aquaculture, or is too salty?
No, I think that, again, it has to do with the harvest and how it is processed, but I think it can be definitely used. I think it's a real good, it will be a very good choice in the future. And one of the things that you have to keep in mind too is that the growth of seaweed, if you were to have large, for want of a better word, farms or plantations of seaweed is very, very efficient in taking carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. Yeah. So it is a very environmentally sustainable type of food ingredient, potentially, because it also reduces the carbon footprint of all the other things that are happening in the world in terms of their release. So again, some of these are probably my personal opinions. I'm sure other people share them, but I guess I do believe that seaweed will be an important.
Yeah, as a culture. Well, here in Mexico, in Ensenada, they have started already with the marine agriculture, no, with the certuche. But I think that the sargasso that is coming to the beach, along the beach in the Caribbean, it comes already dead. I mean, sometimes it's rotten, so probably it will be difficult to use it. This is my opinion, my personal opinion. Well, we have another question from Mayra Gonzalez. Several of the ingredients mentioned as alternative sources of protein or oil have been proven very efficient in promoting growth of fish at the laboratory scale. As you mentioned, the main constraint at this point is to scale up their production and to offer them at a price that it will be feasible for the aquaculture industry to use them. How long do you think it will take those industries to catch up the aquaculture needs?
Well, I agree completely with the person who's providing the question in terms of what's needed. Trying to predict when that would come about. I think, again, what happens here is that let's talk about the aquaculture industry globally, as things begin to continue to expand, then that will be a stimulus, if you will, for trying to scale up these particular ingredients. And it is the only way that we can have these particular ingredients. And I think, again, we have to be hopeful. We have to be
positive,
hopeful about technology getting to the point where, in fact, the quality of these particular ingredients and the scalability of these ingredients will come about. If you were to ask me now, how many years will it take that? I don't know how many years, but I think as the aquaculture production continues to increase globally, that the demand may allow for more research into, technological changes that will allow that to happen.
Yes. Well, another question is Juan Carlos Jimenez. It is possible to use a hydrolyzed feather meal for fish and shrimp, and in how percentage do you think it can be used?
Some of those questions I can't answer, but to say, is it possible to use it? Yes. Is it possible to use it as an exclusive source? No. Is it possible to use it to provide particular amino acids in which are prominent in the feather meal? Yes, but again, I don't think it's something that can be an exclusive source. I don't think it can be proportionally speaking, a large amount. But I think, again, to go with the integration concept, that some of it obviously could be used.
Okay, we have another question. It's from Jesus Sendejas. Dr. D'Abramo, great presentation. Nowadays, there is a concern on consumers to be fed with GMO animals or ingredients. That is a big challenge to use corn GMO. linseed oil or GMO modified salmon as Aqua Bounty. Education will be a way to overcome, but humans are reluctant to do it. What can you comment on that?
Well, that's a very, very good point. I think the answer to that really is simply communication with the consumer. We're going to have to get to the point where we come out and discuss the value of these particular products, that they're not, in a sense, having any, detrimental effect on people, that they are important in terms of our environment. They are important in terms of being used as aquafeeds if they are known to be, they're not contributors, if you will, to greenhouse gases and changing, environmental changes in the climate, global warming. But it is very, very difficult. Many of us can see the value of them, but many others, and particularly consumers, cannot, because I think there's a lot of misinformation and disinformation out there, and it becomes more and more difficult to begin to try to educate people about these particular ingredients that have tremendous potential to be used as ingredients in feeds.
Okay. We have another, this Gerardo Reyes. Thanks, Dr. D'Abramo. The holistic approach to aquaculture feed production has to take into account the impact of nutrients on potential pathogenic microorganisms such as virus, bacteria, fungi, and parasites. What do you think?
Yes, very, very important. I tried to talk about that a little bit in terms of how we're evolving as we look at aquafeeds. And I tried to explain that there's definitely going to have to be a need. As we move further and further in terms of the amount of metric tons of feed that we're producing, and I'm talking specifically now about aquaculture, but it relates to other terrestrial animal production, is simply that we have to have transparency in the feed supply chains as they go from the gathering of the raw material, those producers, and then going to the global markets, and then the markets going to where it's going to be used for an ingredient. Let's say that it's an ingredient that's going to be used. We have to find a way to make people feel confident about the product that they're producing. And the only way to do that is through transparency and certification. And otherwise, we're going to run into a real big problem. So something that parallels, if you will, what they're doing now in best management practices in aquaculture and the quality, the certification of the products and all that, I think that's going to have to come to aquafeed too. It has to. And that may be, it's going to be, I won't say a long way off, but it's going to take some time. But it's obvious that we're going to have to get to that point where we feel confident about what ingredients we're using in terms of the feeds that we produce or manufacture.
And well, regarding the certification and transparency, someone there is another comment on congratulates that comment. And how easy do you think it can be done, this transparency, when the people is standing in the feed plants, formulating day by day, depending on the price, and when you need to have a permit, you need to have the certification for your feed, and you cannot change it every week or every month, and you are formulating every day. How can we do in the aquaculture for doing this transparency with the clients, with the producers, to be confident that what is the formulation of the day, what is the formulation of the batch? How can we do that?
Well, there's going to have to be guidelines for the production of particular ingredients, and people are going to have to follow those guidelines. I'm not saying that this is an ideal situation. And when we think about this on a global perspective, it's not going to happen. But the more and more that we can get people involved with providing products that feed manufacturers can be confident about using, the better off we're going to be. Am I saying that this has to happen throughout the world? No, it's not going to be happen throughout the world. And in fact, there are going to be places where people are still using ingredients that they have, you know, within their particular country, their environment. And what kind of control can we have over that? We're talking about, I think, aquafeed companies that are producing, you know, millions of metric tons of feed, and outsourcing and making sure that the sources of those ingredients adhere to a particular process.
Yeah, it's a difficult point.
It is very difficult because, you know, we're talking about too things like you know, importing feeds. There might be some great feeds that are being produced with particular ingredients that have been, if you will, certified, but how are you going to get them to a particular place, let's say in Africa, where there's no, you know, there are very few feed mills and all that. It's just not possible because you have this import problem too of getting it there, and where are you going to store it and things like that. So some of it, I think, is related to global location, you know, but I still think that we need to try to be able to create a situation where we can have more confidence in the feeds that we're giving to any of our animals,
Yeah.
whether it's aquaculture or poultry.
Yes, yeah,
Well,
no, I will say probably it's a communication between the producers and the feed plants, just to know and be confident. Because, for example, now in the pandemic, you are talking about Africa, but here we are very close to the border, and the prices and supplies are changing a lot because there is no poultry byproduct meal. It has been lower the production, so the prices increase. Now we are not allowed to import corn. GMO corn is a new policy. I don't know if it's applied already, but I mean, a lot of changes. And so the people doing the feed formulation, they have quite a difficult task.
Absolutely. When you add something like a pandemic onto it, and you know, the problems with imports of particular ingredients and like that, it becomes very, very difficult.
Yes.
It's not something that's going to happen and by 2050. It's not going to happen in 30 years, but I think we can make considerable progress towards that, so we can feel a little bit more confident about what we're feeding the animals.
Yes, exactly. Well, Lu, I think that, I don't know if there is any more. Yes. What is your experience in the use of additives such as nucleotides or beta-glucans? And have you measured the impact on immunity? And also, great presentation. That is from Francisco Flores.
I don't have any personal experience with using, what was I going to say, probiotics. No experience with using nucleotides, but I can tell you from my experience of reading the results in published articles and all that, some of the formulations that I have developed do include those particular ingredients, particularly nucleotides, which I think are very, very important.
Well, I think that now the time is over. And thank you very much, Luis. I do always appreciate your contribution for AMENA. Yes. And I'm sure that all the 71 attendees, they also are grateful to listen to you.
Well, it's a pleasure. And again, you know, I have my thoughts that have developed over the past, I hate to say this, probably over 40 years, but I think the intent too is to get people, give you a background, but to get people or incite people, stimulate people to think about what we need to do and think about how we can get there, or at least have in mind the importance of the sustainability concepts and the holistic concepts. And a good example is the fish meal and the fish oil. That's going to be those ingredients are not going to be needed. I think they could potentially be eliminated or at least used in a very small scale. And what that means, again, if that were to be done, what that means to providing protein that wasn't there, but that now will be there for a segment of the population of the world.
Mm-hmm. Yes, that's true. Well, Lu, thank you very much. I do really appreciate. And I don't know if Ana have some announcements to do.
Hola, Teresa. Sí, gracias. Well, first of all, I would like to thank Dr. Luis de Abramo for an excellent presentation. It will be available in our YouTube channel. So thank you very much, Dr. de Abramo, for giving us your time and excellent information. Igualmente, pues agradecerle a Tere por su trabajo como moderadora. Por ahí en el chat les dejé una serie de enlaces. Está ahí un enlace a la encuesta que hacemos de cada uno de nuestros seminarios. Les agradecemos si nos ayudan calificando. Esto nos ayuda pues a ver qué temas son de interés y qué dirección debemos de seguir con nuestros seminarios. Igualmente les dejé ahí el enlace a nuestro siguiente seminario. Este es el martes 23 de febrero. Es un seminario de la industria con Olmix. El título de la presentación es Link entre inmunidad y nutrición a través de la alimentación. Los esperamos entonces el martes 23 de febrero. Igualmente tendremos nuestro siguiente seminario de nutrición, nuestro cuarto seminario del 2021. Este va a ser el lunes 1 de marzo a las 17 horas. El título de la presentación es El microbioma intestinal y la salud de la mascota. Esta presentación va a ser igual en inglés. Los esperamos. Va a haber traducción simultánea igualmente. Igual les pedimos que vayan apartando la fecha del martes 9 de marzo para nuestro seminario de la industria con Fileo. Y es el martes 9 de marzo a las 17 horas. Aparten la fecha. Ahí les estaremos dando más información en el futuro. Y pues finalmente recordarles que tenemos estas fechas disponibles todavía para los seminarios de la industria, por si alguno de ustedes está interesado en organizar uno. Tenemos disponibles el 23 de marzo, el 6 y 20 de abril. Y si están interesados, les agradecemos mandar un correo a administracion@amena.mx y yo les estaré mandando más información. Finalmente, pues ya saben, las grabaciones de estos seminarios están en nuestro canal de YouTube. Les agradecemos suscribirse para que pues les avise cuando subamos un nuevo video y ahí puedan revisar la información de los seminarios pasados. Y bueno, pues finalmente agradecerles a todos ustedes por acompañarnos, por dar este tiempo a la acuacultura, a la nutrición sustentable y ver pues qué opciones tenemos para un mejor futuro. Thank you once again, Dr. de Abramo, for joining us and sharing all your knowledge.
Muchas gracias a todos.
Gracias.
Gracias, Lu.
Gracias.